Today, we'll begin looking at the actual evolutionary history of human beings, examining the fossil record as we currently understand it, and assigning paleospecies names as necessary to trace the phylogenetic tree from our common ancestors with other primates. As a prologue to this unit, though, let me warn you that there will be a lot of very complicated scientific names, dates, and foreign place names involved. Don't try to just memorize these facts. Rote memorization is a terrible way to learn. Humans just don't do it very well. Instead, approach the evolution of hominins as a narrative. These aren't just random strings of letters that you have to memorize, but the names of characters and stories who play certain roles in the plot. And those dates aren't just random numbers, but particular scenes in a longer story. Our minds naturally remember stories much more easily, and you'll gain a much better understanding of how we have come to be who we are. First, of course, it's important to stress that pretty much everything included in this and later lectures is only a best guess. We have an extremely spotty fossil record, which is extremely difficult to date or interpret. Sometimes scholars liken the task to assembling a jigsaw puzzle, but it's actually much worse than that. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle without knowing what the final picture will look like, without knowing whether you have all the pieces. In fact, we're fairly certain that we're missing most of those pieces. And without knowing whether you're accidentally mixing up all the pieces from several puzzles. And again, there's a good chance we've done just that, including some early fossils that aren't our ancestors at all. And of course, before you can put any of those puzzle pieces together, you first have to hunt them down. They're scattered over an entire continent, and you only have very vague ideas where. Put like that, it's not surprising that we don't know more. What's amazing is that we feel pretty confident that we know the broad outlines of the picture all those puzzle pieces form. Let's begin by reviewing anthropoids, which you'll remember from the last unit are monkeys, apes, and humans. Primates in general had diverged from other mammals before the extinction of the dinosaurs. Lemurs and lorises then split off from other primates, and then tarsiers. Anthropoids are all primates more closely related to humans than are tarsiers. The first section of the chapter discusses early anthropoids such as Darwinius, Egyptopithecus, and Proconsul in some detail. I won't devote time in lecture to them, but as usual, read the text closely because you'll be responsible for it on the exam. The next topic your textbook addresses is one that is really important to understand before we dive headfirst into the fossils, and that is, how do paleoanthropologists know any of this stuff? I'm going to pass over this too, so we have sufficient time to look at the fossils directly. However, know especially the different dating methods discussed in the textbook, as well as what the Oldowan industry was. We'll discuss the Oldowan industry in more detail next time alongside later developments. So by the end of the Miocene, about 5 million years ago, the African great apes had diverged into 3 lineages. One would go on to evolve into modern gorillas, one would eventually diverge into both chimps and bonobos, and the third lineage was hominins. Hominin is the taxonomic term referring to all bipedal hominoids back to the divergence with African great apes. That is, it's all species more closely related to modern humans than are chimps and bonobos. So hominins are animal species more closely related to us than chimps and bonobos. That's a formal definition, but it doesn't help much when presented with a fossil. Imagine a lump of mineralized bone. Is it from a hominin or not? Was the animal it came from more closely related to modern humans than our chimps and bonobos? The formal definition doesn't help much in answering whether it's a hominin or not. To answer that question, we need not only a formal definition, but also an operational definition. That is, what characteristics can we use to differentiate hominin fossils from non-hominin fossils? The problem is that hominins are an excellent example of mosaic evolution, a pattern of evolution in which the rate of evolution in one functional system varies from that in other systems. Today, there are many traits that we can look at to say they differentiate Homo sapiens, modern humans, from Pantroglodytes, modern chimpanzees. But those traits didn't appear all at once, and when they did appear, it was part of a long, ongoing process. So, at what point do we say this fossil is similar enough to Homo sapiens and different enough from Pantroglodytes that it qualifies as a hominin? Today, the single trait that is used most often to differentiate hominins from other hominids is bipedalism, walking on 2 feet. Note, however, that there are plenty of other bipedal animals, birds, their dinosaur ancestors, even kangaroos. So the real criterion is a bipedal primate. If the species is an upright walking ape, we can label it as a hominin and part of our particular evolutionary lineage. Unfortunately, that operational definition won't allow us to identify the very earliest hominins. Bipedalism must have evolved sometime after the split with the other apes, so those very first hominins that were just starting to evolve bipedalism wouldn't be recognizable as hominins. But bipedalism is the best criterion we have, and we make do with it. A note on terminology here. Figure 8.13 in your textbook gives the traditional and the new taxonomy of the hominoids. The new taxonomy is very new, only coming into widespread usage in the past couple decades. The new system more accurately reflects the evolutionary relationships, though, so it is much more popular among anthropologists today. The problem is, by shuffling around where animals are categorized, the new system has introduced some potential confusion. In the old system, every species more closely related to humans than chimps and bonobos was called a hominid with a D. Now that term hominid with a D applies also to the non-human great apes. So why make this change? Here's a phylogenetic tree of the great apes. Under the traditional taxonomy, in widespread use throughout the early 1990s, these species were called pongid, and these were called hominid. You'll notice that the term pongid includes only some of the descendants of the common ancestor at the base of the tree. That means that pongid doesn't designate an evolutionary clade, because clades consist of all the descendants of an ancestor, not just some. Under the new terminology, these species are hominids, and these are hominins. Since the categories nest one within another, they each represent true clades, and they more accurately reflect the evolutionary past. Unfortunately, this change is quite recent. A lot of older books are still around, and in them, the term hominid evolution actually refers to the same species we're talking about as hominins. Moreover, many recent books, magazine articles, and so on are written by journalists who took their Intro to Physical Anthropology courses in the 1990s, and they only learned the traditional taxonomy. They're not necessarily aware that the proper terminology has changed. Basically, you need to take into account the date of publication of a book and who wrote it before you can really know what the term hominid means, whether it includes the African apes or not. Be very careful of that. But back to bipedalism. If it really is the most defining traits of hominins, what is it? Well, obviously walking on 2 feet, but how did we evolve that gait? Bipedalism has been jokingly called serial monopedalism because really, about 75% of the time, only 1 foot is on the ground. As you walk, most of the time you're actually balanced on only 1 foot. That gait is different from many other 2-footed animals who spend much more time on both feet. Moreover, we're not just bipeds. Hominins are the only primates who are both habitual and obligatory bipeds. An habitual biped is one who moves bipedally most of the time. Bipedalism is the default mode of locomotion, and any other locomotion is the exception. In all other primates, including chimps, it's the other way around. They can walk on 2 feet, but most of the time they choose not to do so. An obligatory biped, on the other hand, is one whose locomotion is only bipedal. Anatomical changes have made other forms of locomotion highly inefficient. It's important to note that these two characteristics are not interchangeable, nor are they alternatives. They refer to very different aspects of bipedalism. In this table, habitual bipedalism is represented by rows. Habitually bipedal species are in the top row, and those who are not habitual are in the bottom row. Obligatory bipedalism is represented by columns. The right column has species that are obligatory bipeds, and the left column has those species that have other modes of locomotion available to them. Most hominins fall into the upper right cell, but no other primates do. A couple species of hominin are in the upper left, but all other primates are in the lower left. No species is in the lower right because that combination doesn't make logical sense. At any rate, don't make the common mistake of thinking that because a species is not an obligatory biped, it must be habitual, or vice versa. Those two qualities are largely independent of one another. So, if this adaptation is so unusual, why might our hominin ancestors have evolved it? No one really knows, but there are a couple common ideas. The first is that bipedalism leaves the hands free for carrying tools. Remember that I said one of the benefits of knuckle walking for chimps and gorillas was that they could still carry something in their hands. Full bipedalism makes carrying things even easier, and that probably really helped our ancestors to become more and more effective tool users. Another possibility is that bipeds are taller than similar mass quadrupeds. On the African savanna, with its tall grasses, a biped of the same body size would be able to see farther and therefore have more warning when predators were approaching or more chance of locating food at a distance. Whatever the case, we know that by about 4.4 million years ago, our ancestors were habitually bipedal when on the ground, though not necessarily obligatory bipeds because they still spent much time in the trees. The earliest bipedal hominins were probably not as efficient as bipeds as we are. After all, we've had 4 million more years to perfect the process. But they were upright walking, and they were used to it. That popular image of the hunchbacked caveman is entirely inaccurate. These species had more or less just as good a posture as any average modern human. This is all thanks to a variety of skeletal adaptations that first made habitual bipedalism possible, then eventually made bipedalism obligatory. The most important and obvious skeletal change was to the pelvis. The ilia, the broad flat parts of the pelvis, are much more short in bipeds, and instead of extending along the sides of the abdomen as they do for quadrupeds, they form a sort of bowl at the bottom of it. Bipeds also have longer legs relative to overall body size, because a longer stride is more efficient in bipeds. The femurs angle inward slightly so that in a comfortable stance, the knees are closer together than the hips. This moves the feet directly under the center of gravity for balance when only one foot is on the ground. Also, the feet have undergone a variety of changes, the most obvious of which is that the big toe no longer diverges and is not opposable. This removes the foot's ability to grasp, but makes it a much better base for balancing weight. Finally, the foramen magnum, the hole through which the spinal cord enters the skull, is moved forward, directly under the skull. This mounts the head directly over the spinal column, and thus the center of gravity, instead of out in front of it. All of these skeletal adaptations, among others, make us able to walk upright. The fossil record is quite clear about the skeletal adaptations. Hominins had begun developing a bipedal skeleton by about 4.4 million years ago. And by about 4 million years ago, our ancestors were fully habitual and obligatory bipeds. The rest of this lecture will be a whirlwind tour through several million years of hominin evolution. In fact, The bulk of hominin evolution will be covered in the next few minutes, and we'll spend the next several lectures looking in detail at the last third or so. This is because the farther back in time we look, the less evidence we have to reconstruct hominin evolution. There just isn't as much to say about this very early period. Before we start, though, a few comments on binomial nomenclature, the rules by which we name species, both living and extinct. Species are generally named by a combination of their genus and species names. If there's a subspecies, we include it after the species name. So we are Homo sapiens sapiens, for example, because we belong to the subspecies sapiens of species sapiens in genus Homo. Names for these taxons are always in Latin, and like any foreign language term used in English, they're always italicized. The genus name is always capitalized, but the species and subspecies are never capitalized. If the context makes it clear which genus is intended, we can abbreviate it with an initial. And if the species or subspecies names are unknown or unimportant, we can abbreviate them with a generic placeholder. Knowing these rules is important because it helps to streamline communication and ensure that everyone's on the same page as we dive into the complexities of our evolutionary past. Moving back to the actual fossil record, though, the textbook divides these early hominins into 3 classes, and their scheme makes sense, so we'll stick with it. We'll start with the so-called pre-Australopiths. As you might guess, these are any hominins after the chimp divergence and before a later category called Australopithecines. Right now, the dates are maybe 6 million years ago to 4.4 million years ago or so. This straddles the very end of the Miocene epoch and the very beginning of the Pliocene. The earliest fossil yet found, which is considered a possible hominin, is known as Sahelanthropus tchadensis. In Latin, that name means man of the Sahel from Chad. This fossil was found in the nation of Chad, in the southern portion of the Sahara Desert known as the Sahel. This is surprising for a couple reasons. First, it's very far from the East African fossil beds that have given us most of the early hominin fossils. Second, in the 6 million years ago time frame that the fossil is dated to, the area was quite densely forested. If Sahelanthropus is a hominin, its time and location contradicts many models of hominin evolution, which require a patchy landscape of trees and grasses. On the other hand, Sahelanthropus is known by only a single, poorly preserved skull and no postcranial elements. We really can't tell with any certainty whether it was bipedal, and some scholars prefer to think of it as a non-hominin ape. It's possible this is a cousin of modern chimpanzees, rather than an ancestor of modern humans. Next is Orrorin tugenensis, also at about 6 million years ago, from the Tugen Hills of Kenya in East Africa. Opposite of Sahelanthropus, this is really only known by postcranial fossils and no skulls. There are enough fossils to make a strong case for at least some adaptation to bipedalism, but not much else. Moving north to Ethiopia, the next hominin genus is Ardipithecus. These hominins appear in the fossil record about 5.8 million years ago and last up to about 4.4 million years ago. While earlier fossils have no specific species names attached to them, fossils from the end of that time span are known as Ardipithecus ramidus. One of the most complete skeletons ever recovered from this early time period, known as Ardi, belongs to this species. Ardi tells us that by about 4.4 million years ago, our ancestors were quite efficient bipeds, but still spending a lot of time in trees. While Ardi has a bowl-shaped bipedal pelvis, she still has divergent big toes on grasping feet used for climbing. In terms of size and appearance, to the untrained eye, Ardi would probably have looked a lot like a chimp with better posture. These very early fossils suggest that our ecological understanding of early hominin evolution may well be wrong. We had originally believed that the split between chimps and hominins had taken place in savannas and patchy forests. Now it seems the event may have taken place in more densely forested regions. We'll need much more research to figure out exactly what was going on about 5 million years ago in Africa. After the pre-Australopiths, you'd obviously come to the Australopithecines. This Latin name means southern apes. The term Australopithecine is an informal term including two genera, Australopithecus and Paranthropus. The older of the two genera is Australopithecus. It evolved, probably from Ardipithecus, about 4.2 million years ago. The last of the Paranthropus species died out about 1 million years ago. That makes Australopithecines the most successful class of hominins by endurance. No other category has lasted as long. Australopithecines and early Homo are known as Pleistocene hominins because this crucial period of hominin evolution straddles the boundary between those two epochs. The earliest species of Australopithecus is Australopithecus anamensis. Anamensis lived in East Africa from about 4 million years ago to 3 million years ago, and is probably ancestral to all later species of hominin. By far, the most well-known Australopithecus is Australopithecus afarensis. Afarensis lived in the same general time frame as Anamensis, but probably evolved somewhat later from a branch of the Anamensis line. Afarensis is also considered probably an ancestor of the later hominin lineage leading to humans. The most spectacular fossil of Afarensis, dating to 3.9 to 3 million years ago, is called Lucy. She, like Ardi, is a remarkable find. She still looks quite primitive in many ways, like having a dental arch that is parallel, like a chimp, rather than curved, like us, and having a small sagittal crest along the crown of her skull. Other characteristics, though, look quite modern. Her pelvis, for example, tells us that she was fully bipedal, as do the fossilized footprints at Laetoli, dating to 3.7 to 3.5 million years ago, that your textbook discusses. Males of the species may have been about 5 feet tall, and females about 3 to 4 feet tall. Nevertheless, the average cranial capacity for Australopithecus afarensis, which tells us how big their brains were, is only marginally larger than modern chimps, at about 420 cubic centimeters. Since A. afarensis bodies and brains were roughly comparable to chimps, we can guess that their intellectual capacity was roughly comparable as well. Around 2.5 million years ago in East Africa, Australopithecus afarensis appears to have undergone an adaptive radiation, leading to all the later Pleistocene species. It's easy to see on this phylogenetic tree. Below A. afarensis, its ancestors mostly follow a single path, with one species giving rise to the next. But A. afarensis gives rise to 3 separate lineages of hominin, all sometime between 3 and 2.5 million years ago. One of these lineages produced the genus Paranthropus, which are sometimes called the robust Australopithecines. This genus is much more specialized and derived in its physiology, especially its skull. Scholars have called Paranthropus Nutcracker Man because his huge jaw, extreme musculature, and gigantic teeth seem custom-made for cracking nuts. In fact, most scholars now think Paranthropus lived primarily on fibrous and starchy roots. This is a good example, though, of why evolution is not a goal-oriented process. The several species of Paranthropus are less like modern humans than their ancestor Australopithecus afarensis, which suggests that they're not our ancestors at all, but a branch of the family tree that has since died out completely. That seems to have happened as late as 1 million years ago. Now, in this class, you won't need to differentiate among the 3 species of Paranthropus, just know the genus Paranthropus. There was also another branch of the adaptive radiation that did not lead to us. This branch moved into southern Africa and preserved the ancestral traits of earlier, more generalized Australopithecus. One species on this branch was Australopithecus africanus. This was actually the first species of hominin to be defined in Africa. Found by Raymond Dart in South Africa in 1924, the tongue child, an infant A. africanus fossilized skull, is credited with demonstrating that hominins did evolve in Africa. This also explains why Australopithecus is named southern ape in Latin. It was first identified in South Africa. Another South African Australopithecine was Australopithecus sediba. These fossils were only found quite recently and date to just a bit less than 2 million years ago. Lee Berger, the paleoanthropologist who first found A. sediba, suggested it was the transitional form between afarensis and later Homo, but this cannot be the case. A. sediba fossils date to around 2 million years ago, but Homo fossils elsewhere in Africa are much older. The earliest Homo fossils date to about 2.8 to 2.5 million years ago in East Africa, much too old and in the wrong place to be descended from A. sediba. If we can't place the genus Homo as a branch off of the southern Australopithecines, then there must have been a third branch of the A. afarensis adaptive radiation, which produced Homo habilis. Homo habilis has the distinction of being the first hominin to belong to our own genus. Homo habilis is assigned to our own genus, but that is not without its controversy. Brain sizes are still quite small, about 631 cubic centimeters on average, which is only a bit more than a third the size of a modern human brain, but significantly larger than any contemporary species. Habilis is known largely from fossils that date to about 1.8 million years ago, but members of the genus Homo are suspected to have evolved by about 2.5 million years ago at least. This suspicion is based on a few scattered fossils, but also on the belief that Homo was the genus behind the Oldowan industry, the earliest widespread stone tool technology. In fact, habilis is primarily known from fossils found at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, and that is exactly the place that the Oldowan industry is named for. On the other hand, there's really no strong evidence that habilis is the tool maker, even though his name means handyman in Latin. The paleoanthropologist who first found the fossils, Louis Leakey, thought he was the toolmaker, and Leakey named him appropriately. In fact, there's no strong evidence linking habilis to the Oldowan industry other than time and place, and other hominins, especially Paranthropus, were around at the same time. It's possible that Paranthropus was behind the Oldowan tools. Furthermore, recent discoveries at a site called Lamekwi suggest that stone tool technology dates back as far as 3.3 million years ago, well before any Homo or Paranthropus fossils. This leaves Australopithecus as the only option for the first stone tool maker. Lamekwi is still a controversial site, however, and we must wait for more evidence. Homo habilis continued on as a distinct species for over 1 million years, but it appears to have gone extinct by 1.4 million years ago. Before that happened, about 2 million years ago, some Homo habilis populations had evolved into a truly different kind of hominin, Homo erectus. After the last few Paranthropus went extinct about 1 million years ago, only Homo erectus remained to carry the hominin lineage forward. That's where we will pick up next time.